Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a round of applause as Father Murray talks about the current state of vocations.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here to speak in the Lincoln Diocese to the Serra Club, but I know it's not just people from Nebraska here tonight and people from Lincoln Diocese, but from the state and from the neighboring states. Being a New Yorker, it's great to be in the heartland of America, and I've been out here a number of times. Lincoln used to send their seminarians to New York. For about 20, 25 years they came out. So back in 1981, I was in the seminary starting in 1980, but in 1981 Bishop Flavin sent the first seminarians to us, so I'm friendly with a lot of priests from this diocese and blessed to know them. Yeah, so Lincoln has always been an inspiration as regards vocations, just simply because of how many they had and continue to have. Bishop Flavin and his diocese inspired so many young men who went to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln to join the seminary. And now we have a crisis, as you probably are aware, in vocations in the United States and even throughout the world. So that's why the work of the Serra Club is so important, because promoting awareness of vocations, inspiring young men to think about it, and then using personal influence to speak to people and encourage their vocations. To give you a statistic, just how difficult things are right now, I was at a gathering of priests the other day, and there was a seminarian there, so I asked, well, how many seminarians do we have in the Archdiocese of New York? And he said, we have a total of 24. That includes everybody from college seminarians to the people in theology. 24. And in theology, meaning in the years of preparation for ordination, we have a total of 17. But this year the Vatican started something called a propedeutic year. You may have heard about it. Formerly, you went to the college seminary or the equivalent program for those who had already been in college, so typically 2 years of philosophy, 4 years of theology. But the Holy See was concerned that many of the men who were entering theology did not have sufficient formation in Catholic life and culture, so they wanted a year in which they could review things and then also basically train them in the life of prayer and Catholic life. So they started, so basically now if you enter the seminary, you have to do 5 years in theology. So we have in Dunwoody, or in the seminary for New York, 17 men over 6 years, because there was also a pastoral year thrown in, which they would ask you after third theology to go work in a parish for a year. That's going away because no bishop wants to tell a young man who's graduated and knows all his philosophy, you've got to wait 6 years to become a priest. Now, when I entered the seminary, there were 20 men in my class alone in theology. So, and there were in the total seminary, there were 90 men over 5 years. So we've gone from 90 over 5 years to 17 over 6. There are about 2.2 million Catholics in the Archdiocese of New York. Now, Lincoln, I was asking a friend of mine about how many, Father Monsignor Fucinaro, how many seminarians they have. You have 22 seminarians in this diocese for the whole program, but total number of Catholics in Lincoln, 100,000. So you can see, per capita, Lincoln has the highest percentage of seminarians to Catholics in the country. So they have to continue to inspire us, and they do that with their own seminary, with the Newman chaplaincy. This is one of the most magnificent Newman chaplaincies that I've ever seen. I was vocationed under God's grace, came at the Newman Center at Dartmouth College, where I was a student. So I really appreciate the work that is done in Newman chaplaincy. So for all Serra members, if you have Newman chaplaincies within your diocese, definitely get to know the priests who are there, encourage them, because a lot of young people young men who are thinking about the seminary and young women who are thinking about religious life will make those decisions in college. Now, it's my privilege to be a commentator on EWTN with Raymond Arroyo, and I know a number of you are fans of EWTN, and continue to do that. Keep watching. Mother Angelica left a great heritage, and part of what we do is comment on news in the life of the church. So I thought the vocational situation in the church is very much related to how the church is understood through its actions and what's been going on since the resignation of Pope Benedict. And that's the resignation of Pope Benedict in 2013 was the time when I started appearing regularly on EWTN. So I wanted to review what's going on in the life of the church and why that is of concern. Now, back about 10 to 12 years ago, the North American College had over 200 seminarians. That's the seminary in Rome. Last year, they only had about 110. And this year, the first class is under 30. It's 29. So there's a decline in the number of seminarians who are entering. Part of that problem was COVID, because the North American College actually closed for the first time since the Second World War, when it was closed during Mussolini's reign in Italy. But there is a decline in the number of seminarians going over to Rome to study. And, you know, this is of concern. I think part of the problem in the life of the church now is confusion, doctrinal confusion, and bishops and theologians who are saying things that are contradictory to the faith. And then we have this whole process of synodality, which is now what's going on. So I want to talk about that. I'll refer to things that are going on, and then some things that Pope Francis has said that I find difficult to understand and troubling, and then some of the things that are happening throughout the church. Now, Cardinal Raymond Burke, who is the former Archbishop of St. Louis, and he also was the head of the Apostolic Signatura in Rome. He's originally a priest from the La Crosse Diocese in Wisconsin. He's offered a preface to this book, which I highly recommend to you. The book is called The Synodal Process is a Pandora's Box. So when Pope Francis announced the Synod on Synodality, people were surprised because synods typically had been dedicated to topics of concern in the life of the church: vocation, family life, marriage, things, catechesis, you know, how we transmit the faith. Instead, the Pope decided it would be a synod of bishops to discuss what a synod of bishops is supposed to be and how this process is supposed to guide the church. But it's not proven to be exactly what we thought it would be. Now, the Synod of Bishops was very well described by Pope Francis himself, because in 2014 he wrote a letter in which he commented on how the Synod of Bishops had been established by Pope Paul VI. After the Second Vatican Council, the Pope decided that he would establish something called the Synod of Bishops, which is an organization separate from the Roman Curia, which gathers representative bishops throughout the world to meet in Rome from time to time in order to discuss topics of interest to the church. Evangelization was one of the first topics that was taken up. Why did this happen? Well, Pope Francis said the following. This was established by Pope St. Paul VI to meet the need to strengthen by closer bonds the union of the Bishop of Rome with the bishops whom the Holy Spirit has constituted to govern the Church of God. So the governance of the Church of God is entrusted to certain people. It's not given to all of us. It's given to the bishops by divine will. The Pope Francis said, it is necessary more than ever to further revitalize the close relationship between all the pastors of the Church. There is no doubt that the Bishop of Rome is in need of the presence of his brother bishops of their guidance and of their prudence and experience. And that indeed is part of the reason why Pope Paul VI wanted this. You know, it used to be the Italians ran the whole Vatican, you know. Pope Paul VI, Pius the 11th and then Pius the 12th brought in others to work in the Roman Curia to help the pontiff. And then Paul VI started what's called the internationalization of the Roman Curia. So they would seek they would seek priests to work, and then also bishops, but mostly priests, so that you would have a broader perspective. So after the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI said, we're going to have this periodic meeting of bishops, which will come together, and bishops will be elected from the different regions of the world that come together and discuss things. But it was bishops. It was them because they are the shepherds constituted by Christ. Now, why are these valuable? Again, Pope Francis said, the synodal assemblies have offered the successor of Peter valuable help and guidance in order to safeguard and increase the faith, in order to courageously offer the integrity of Christian life and strengthen the discipline of the Church. So here we go. This is what the Synod is meant to do. We want to safeguard and increase the faith. That's the mission. The shepherds are there to protect the sheep. The sheep and the shepherds have a relationship of mutual dependence. The sheep depend on the shepherd to guide them, and then the shepherd depends on the sheep in order to carry out the evangelization, not only of the sheep, but of everybody else, because there are, as the Lord said, there are people who are not in the flock that he wants us to approach. So we want to increase and safeguard the faith and to courageously offer the integrity of Christian life. So that means, contradict the world and by the way we live our faith, that we believe in the moral law, we believe in the life of prayer, we believe in the imperative of charity. All of those things are important. And then there's discipline in the church. So discipline in the church obviously means you obey the rules, not because simply rule obeying is something good, it is, but because the rules come from God. And then through the church, we're reminded of what those rules mean in specific circumstances. So the Synod of Bishops is a very valuable institution, but what happened? Now Pope Francis has decided that lay people will be part of the Synod of Bishops. So this is strange. The only reason why the Synod of Bishops is constituted is because it's made up of bishops. If you want to have a synod of lay people, meaning a meeting of lay people to get together, you can convoke that. But if you mix the two together, you get a hybrid, which doesn't really respond to the nature of what we're talking about. You can't call it a Synod of Bishops if a lay person has the same authority and power in a bishop to vote on propositions that the bishops have. But that's what Pope Francis has done. Now, the press release from the Holy See describing this new arrangement was issued on April 26, 2023. And it claims these modifications, which are warranted under the context of the synodal process, will not, however, change the episcopal nature of the assembly. And that's just not true. You hate to contradict the Vatican, but if I say we're having a meeting of the women's club and men are now invited, we're going to keep it calling it a women's club. It's not a women's club anymore. It's a women and men's club. And it's the same thing with the College of Cardinals. Imagine if some lay people were put into the Sistine Chapel to vote for the next pope. Nobody would say it was the College of Cardinals elected the pope. They would say the College of Cardinals and a bunch of lay people brought in elected the pope. So this is not what I was expecting, and it is not what people are expecting, but the Pope has an approach or something new in which he sees the meeting of people to discuss things and vote on propositions and come to conclusions, that it should involve everybody in the church, not just the bishops. But wait a minute. The reason you meet and discuss things, as I said earlier, was promote discipline, teach doctrine, promote the integrity of Christian life. Jesus did not give that task to lay people. That's not, and if Jesus did that, that means it's not wrong. We believe in a hierarchical church precisely because there's a distinction of roles. There were the 12 apostles, and then the broader group of disciples, which included men and women, and then you had the rest of the flock. So we have a problem here because, as I see it, the Pope has changed the nature of this institution meant to advise him on how to run the church to make it sort of a representative institution for everybody in the church. And as the synod roles changed, now you have lay people, you have deacons, you have priests, you have nuns, you have brothers, then you have bishops, and then almost every cardinal is a bishop already, so the cardinals will be there too. All of these people are now called into Rome. The group that will be starting the meeting in the first week of October will have approximately 360 to 400 people meeting in it. And it's going to include a large group of lay people. It's 50 or more lay people and nuns, and et cetera. So that's a different reality. And the reason why we find this difficult is because you should not intrude in somebody's responsibilities with people who don't have those responsibilities. Christ did not give to lay people, to priests, to nuns, the responsibility for being the shepherds of the church. That is given to the bishops and the Pope under him. The Pope has a different approach, but that doesn't mean that we can't question it or object to it. And that's the stuff I should basically say. It's not rude or impertinent or disloyal to question a practical governance decision of the Pope. You know, that's part of the life of the church. Simple example, Pope Paul VI abolished fish on, no meat on Friday. He said you don't have to do that anymore. He recommended that you do it if you want to, he didn't. Now you could say that was a good decision, that was a bad decision. That's up to your free and independent judgment. Similarly, I think including lay people in the synod is not a good idea. And this, I'll read the justification for calling this a synod of bishops says the following. And this is from the Vatican, from the Synod office. The episcopal nature of the synodal assembly is not affected, but is rather confirmed because non-bishops will be less than 25% of the total number of assembly members. So a 25% diminution of the presence of bishops is treated as not being significant. I don't think the lay people who are chosen would like to consider it that way. They're obviously not there as bishops, so they don't want to be told this is still a bishop's assembly, but wait a minute, they're equal members of it. Now, when they decided to do this, they said the lay people don't represent all lay people, but they're there because they participated in the synodal process. And that was also something new that Pope Francis did. In the previous time when synods were done, the topic was chosen, it was sent out to the bishops' conference, and they were asked to consult and get thoughts about it, and then report back to Rome what they came up with. And the bishops were free to consult anybody they wanted. This time, Pope Francis said every diocese has to have meetings. Maybe some of you might have participated in some of those synodal meetings. I went to the one that was held in Manhattan, in my area, and basically there was no predetermined topic, because that's another thing. The synod and synodality is kind of an open discussion topic. What does it mean to walk together as lay people, bishops, etc.? But the people who participated in that, from that group, there were going to be 70 appointed lay people and others, meaning deacons or priests or nuns, from the 7 regions of the world that the Pope was seeking membership of non-bishops from. But then they said it is requested that 50% of them be women and that the presence for young people also be emphasized. So it's this, I don't know if you heard, the European Union has said that all the governments should be 50% male, 50% female. And my answer is, hey, In a free country, if you want to elect a man or a woman, that's up to the voters. You decide. But the idea that we're going to restrict because you're male or female. So what we got here is kind of an idea that the lay people are going to be 50% women, so they can represent all the women. Then young people should be there. Now, quite frankly, I love young people, but I don't ask an 18-year-old to sit next to a bishop and tell the rest of us this is what it means to run the Catholic Church. But that's part of what's happening. So this is, in my opinion, a serious error in the life of the synod to extend membership to people who aren't bishops and then to ask them to do, basically a role that they're not ordained to do. Now, this book that I mentioned earlier about the synodal process has a preface by Cardinal Burke, and he said the following about how this synod is developing. I just wanted to read this. Cardinal Burke wrote, "We are told that the church which we profess in communion with our ancestors in the faith from the time of the apostles to be one holy, Catholic, and apostolic is now to be defined by synodality, a term which has no history in the doctrine of the church and for which there is no reasonable definition. Synodality and its adjective synodal have become slogans behind which a revolution is at work to change radically the church's self-understanding in accordance with a contemporary ideology which denies much of what the church has always taught and practiced." So this is what's going on, and I want to demonstrate that by talking about the working document. So what happens at a synod, this is typical of all the synods, before the bishops meet, and now the bishops and non-bishops meet, the Vatican produces a working document, which has suggestions for topics, for discussion, for reflection. So this document for the October Synod came out on June 20th. And unfortunately, it embodies a familiar pattern that we've seen. Certain questions are asked, others are ignored, predictable answers are given, and expectations are raised that a new church, the Holy Spirit-inspired synodal church, will emerge in which everyone will feel seen, recognized, welcomed, accepted, accompanied, cared for, listened to, valued, not judged, and so on. All of those descriptives are found in the working document. And this is a quote from the working document. "A synodal church is open, welcoming, and embraces all. The radical call is therefore to build together synodally an attractive and concrete church, an outgoing church in which all feel welcome." End of quote. Okay, what's wrong with that? I cannot control anybody else's feelings. I can try to influence feelings, but I have no control over them. What I can do as a Catholic priest is proclaim the gospel, apply it to the situation that people live in, and ask them to, consider that to be the solution to whatever's bothering them. But the fact of the matter is there are some people who use feelings as a lever to try and compel the church to change teachings they don't agree with. So this is what we have going on here. When you set out to say, we are going to have a meeting so that at the end of it, everybody's going to feel welcome, my thought is, where's the effort to try and get the Church of Latter-day Saints people to show up and feel that they're affirmed in their various beliefs? That's not the group they're trying to influence. It would be a good idea, I think, but it's not what they're... This is about dissident Catholics who don't accept teachings of the church that they don't find acceptable. And therefore, they're constantly saying, I don't feel welcome here. I'm going to display this or illustrate this as we go along here. Now, this is an emotion-centered focus, which is a typical technique that we have in our modern world. And this is producing a soft revolution in which Catholic doctrines that contradict decadent Western sexual mores and radical feminist claims of oppression in the church, all of these things are now framed as obsolete, regrettable, and needless sources of discord and alienation, as holdovers from a cruel past. Doctrines need to be jettisoned because some doctrines make people feel unwelcome. I think we know who we're talking about, and in fact, the Synod is a perfect example of that, because in the Synod they only refer to certain groups. They don't refer to all of the groups. So who do we have? Believe it or not, this is what they say. Remarried divorcees, people in polygamous marriages, LGBTQ plus people. Okay, a couple of things. People who are divorced and remarried are still members of the church. They're just not allowed to receive communion until they have their situation regularized, or unless they live as brother and sister. But now it's been treated, and Pope Francis opened this door in Amoris Laetitia, saying that some people divorced and remarried who don't think they're committing anything wrong should be given communion. This is wrong. I don't think he should have said that. And believe me, I'm not the only priest or bishop out there that says that, but that's there. Polygamous marriages. Does anybody in the world think that God wants polygamy as the rule for the relation between a man and a wife? Of course not. Polygamy is a pagan practice. It was tolerated in the time of the Old Testament, but is gone in the New Testament. What did the Lord say? The man leaves the wife and clings to her husband. The woman leaves his family and clings to her husband. What God has joined together, man must not divide. Marriage is an image, according to St. Paul, of the unity between Christ and his church. Polygamy is horrendous. It's wrong. It has no place. So if polygamists come to me and complain that they don't feel welcome in the Catholic Church, I say, you can feel very welcome, just get rid of all your extra wives. That's not what you're called to live. The Holy See introduces this. Now, LGBTQ is an acronym, meaning it's the first letter of a number of words. Lesbian, gay, it's the same category. Homosexual, people have homosexual problem. B means bisexual, which they assert I'm supposed to have sex with men and women all at the same, in my life. T, transsexual, they call them transgender. The church does not accept the notion that God created anyone in the wrong body, which is what we now have this claim. This is all a fraud. This is ridiculous. How are we responding to it? Thank God women athletes who are being penalized by men who want to get medals and don't care that they pretend to be women and do so. That's who are fighting it. But Riley Gaines, for instance, the swimmer, basically being hounded off the public scene because of vicious people who are promoting this. Nobody in their right mind thinks that you can change from being a man into a woman or vice versa. But you're called upon to pretend it. Q means various things. Questioning, queer, who knows what it, plus depends on which website you go to, could be another 10 or 15 self-asserted things. People say, I'm non-binary. So there's a man, a female, that's binary because there's only two choices. The Catholic Church should never in a document use an acronym like this because it's asserting the existence of something that doesn't exist. But this is being used in a Vatican document. Why is this? Well, because they'll say, in these listening sessions that we had throughout the church and leading up to the meeting, this came up. Well, you think the Latin Mass came up during it? Yes, it did. Does it appear in the Synodal Working Document? No, it doesn't. So, in terms of people feeling excluded, in some dioceses, they're closing down the Latin Mass right and left. They don't get heard in this situation. People who find that there's doctrinal chaos and would like it to change so we can reassert the catechism that Pope John Paul II issued, well, they're not heard. So let me, the synodal document, the working document said the following. Some of the questions that emerged from consultation of the people of God concerning issues on which there is already magisterial and theological teaching to be considered. To give just two examples, we can note the acceptance of remarried divorcees or the inculturation of the liturgy. The fact that these questions continue to emerge on issues like these should not be hastily dismissed, but calls for discernment. And the Synodal Assembly is a privileged forum for doing so. Now, again, the acceptance of remarried divorcees doesn't mean treating them with charity and trying to guide them to the doctrine of the faith. It means giving in to a different teaching. Inculturation of the liturgy, this is a free-for-all. We have pagan elements being introduced in Latin America into some masses because people who are native, indigenous people want to have this, and then some people say this is a good idea. It's not a good idea. It's not a good idea at all. False gods have no place in Catholic worship. Okay, so the problem with the synodal document that they're going to be using is that it basically introduces topics that are really not suitable for discussion. These are the working document lists the following topics as being the first ones to be discussed. 1, war. 2, climate change. 3, an economic system that produces exploitation, inequality, and a throwaway culture. 4th, cultural colonialism. 5th, religious persecution. 6, aggressive secularization. 7, sexual abuse and the abuse of power, conscience, and money. Okay, that sounds like a list that could come from a political party for basically a social action program to change the economy and the government structure. The Catholic Church is not in favor of war. Nobody says that. But we do have a just war teaching. And that's why the Ukrainians should be supported in fighting the Russian invaders. If it weren't for the Americans, France would be speaking German, these days. And we know that. So war can be it's not a good thing per se in the sense killing your fellow man is always a heinous and odious thing, but it's not always wrong. If somebody's trying to kill my sister, I have a right to protect her and if necessary, kill that person. Same thing happens in war. I was a military chaplain. Do you think we sat there saying all of these men and women in the Navy, I was in the Navy, that they're out to do evil and we just got to quell their... No, they're out to do good. I'm very glad when the Navy uses its air power and other forces to stop people who are trying to kill innocent people. Climate change? Okay, that's a very complicated topic. Certainly not something Catholic bishops are experts on. What they really mean is man-made climate change as opposed to natural. Okay, look, fine. You want to have a seminar on that, invite the climatologists in, discuss it, but don't pretend that there's one answer and that this is something suitable for a group of bishops to decide on what to do. Economic system that produces exploitation, inequality, and throwaway culture. So that's a very socialistic interpretation of capitalism. They don't use the word. Exploitation means that there are bosses and then workers. But guess what? There are exploitative bosses, but in a free system, there are also bosses who are very cooperative and produce good ends. You may be some of them here. You may work for some of them. Inequality per se is not a sin. A 10-year-old child is not equal to his parents. A man who's a nuclear physicist is superior in his knowledge to someone who is just entering graduate school. So there is an inequality. The way you deal with inequality is to say, do everybody in their place in the system, does he have the freedom to move up or down wherever he wants to go and participate? But the idea is that since so-and-so's paid more and so-and-so's paid less, we have an unjust system. That's against socialism. That's not what the Catholic Church teaches. Throwaway culture, yes, that's abortion, but the word should have been used. Cultural colonialism, this is ridiculous. Right now, we live in a world that's interconnected by means of communication, which means what I'm saying right now, it's being taped, this could be viewed in the farthest corners of Asia by a group of people who are not English-speaking but are trying to learn it and may be interested in religion. This isn't colonialism. This is a free market of ideas. This is and we would say providentially for the Catholic Church, an opportunity to preach the gospel to people who may not have heard it before. This is, again, this multicultural idea. All cultures are equal. They're not equal. When the Spaniards arrived in Mexico, they found human sacrifice. They suppressed it. They did nothing wrong. Aggressive secularization, yes, that's a big problem. And sexual abuse, certainly by the clergy, a big problem. Now, what words or ideas were not used in the document? Abortion, euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, the spread of atheism, relativism, subjectivism, religious indifference, gender ideology, the redefinition of marriage in the laws of many Western states, coercive programs to impose contraception in the global South. These ideas are not mentioned. What else? Neither are the crises regarding sacramental practices in the church today, the steep decline in mass attendance, the practical disappearance of sacramental confession in many places, the decline in baptisms, confirmations, and marriages, the serious decline in the number of priestly ordinations in the Western world. So I ask the question, did none of these topics surface during the lead up to the Synodal Assembly? And then, this is the most glaring omission, nowhere do we find any mention of the Church's paramount mission, the salvation of souls. There is not a hint that what is most important in the life of the Church is preaching God's gift of eternal life, Christ's call to conversion and repentance. That's the whole thing that the Synod really needs to be talking about, but it's not in the working document. And this is of great concern to myself and to many others who are very concerned about what's going on. Now, another expression is used, which is concerning language. So perhaps you've ever heard this comment. The teaching is fine, but the language has to be updated. In other words, the language is off-putting because people are offended by the language, so we have to get new language. Well, the working document says the following. It calls for, quote, an effort to renew the language used by the Church in its liturgy, preaching, and catechesis, without demeaning or debasing the depth of the mystery that the Church proclaims or the richness of its tradition. The renewal of language must aim instead to make these riches accessible and attractive to the men and women of our time, rather than an obstacle that keeps them at a distance. Now, in my estimation, the people who are dissenters, they understand perfectly well the language of the Church. They're not offended at the language, they're offended at the meaning of the language, the words. In other words, the words say something. They understand it, the Church understands it, they don't agree with it. It's not that the language is arcane, outdated, confusing. And this is, particularly on the question of homosexuality, a big problem. And this is, quote, from the final document. The working document states, quote, the final documents of the Continental Assemblies often mention those who do not feel accepted in the Church, such as divorced and remarried people in polygamous marriage and LGBTQ Catholics. So what's happening is people say, well, the language of the catechism is offensive. Therefore, we have to change the language. But they're going to change the language to change the meaning. Father James Martin, who is one of the main proponents of the homosexual lifestyle's acceptance in the Church, says the catechism language is cruel when it says that let me get the exact phrasing that he used. It's intrinsically disordered behavior, homosexual activity, intrinsically disordered. He wants to change it, he says, to differently ordered. So instead of being disordered, it's differently ordered. That's playing a word. That's not a word game, it's a word strategy. Something that is inherently disordered means that it can never be properly used. So here we are. This is what we're afraid of, is what's happening. And, this is, the Catholic Church has so many crises and problems going on. Should we be discussing the grievances of people who are embracing either sin or erroneous teaching? Because the same thing goes with the ordination of women to the priesthood and the diaconate. And this is brought up. A quote from the working document. Most of the Continental Assemblies and the syntheses of several Episcopal conferences call for the question of women's inclusion in the diaconate to be considered. Is it possible to envision this, and in what way? The Church has already studied this and rejected it. The working document also includes a wider call for the inclusion of women in governance, decision-making, mission, and ministries at all levels, which is again meaning the priesthood. This question has been up ever since Vatican II closed. Pope Paul VI dealt with it. John Paul II dealt with it. Pope Benedict, and with John Paul II, dealt with it. The action of Christ in only choosing the 12 apostles to be the priests of the church is determinative and conclusive. There is no way that the Catholic Church could ever validly ordain a woman. But this is what is wanting to be done. And the fact that we would give this discussion into the forum of a meeting of bishops and lay people in Rome under the Pope, it's a great disservice to the Church. Now, all of this has led to a crisis in practice in the Church. I'll go on for maybe 10 more minutes, and I'll leave time for questions before our holy hour. But what do we have here? We basically have an attempt to change the teaching of the Church under the guise of listening to the Holy Spirit and making people feel welcome and included and listened to. And where does that lead to? Well, let me read for you this article that was published on August 30th at the Catholic Herald, which is a magazine in England. Quote, "A German archbishop has told priests they can confer blessings on same-sex couples without fear of punishment. The move by Archbishop Heiner Koch of Berlin opens the gates to church services for the blessings of couples who cannot or do not want to marry sacramentally." This is ridiculous. This is about blessing the union of two men in a civil union, which is now called marriage in many states, and that the Church should bless it. He wrote a 2,000-word letter to the people of the Archdiocese of Berlin, and he said the following, quote, "It is no longer possible to say that all who are in any so-called irregular situation are in a state of mortal sin and have lost sanctifying grace." Now, this language is very manipulative. The judgment on whether someone's in a state of grace has both an objective and a subjective character. So if someone is committing sodomy on a regular basis, that's objectively sinful. If they do it without knowing it's wrong or they're mentally ill, etc., then you can discuss with the confessor whether it's venial or mortally sinful for them. But it's always a mortal sin in and of itself. This is a basic principle of moral theology. If you do something publicly, your neighbor is entitled to comment on it. You know, the idea that the Catholic Church cannot judge behavior because that's judgmentalism or wrong, this is ridiculous. Remember the Lord said, there were two sons. One said, "I'll go out to do the work," and didn't. The other said no, and he did. And he said, which son, did truly love the Father? We are entitled to comment on the behavior of others. Why? Because we're concerned for their salvation. Why? Because mortal sin is an obstacle to salvation. So if somebody's committing a mortal sin, you should tell them don't do it. Now where the bishop has gone further than that. He's saying that we have to bless relationships which are based on mortal sin. This is what he wrote. "Acknowledging the goodness of a relationship is a way of speaking well of God to those people." Now, wait a minute. If you're doing something that's leading you to go to hell and the person you're cooperating with, and also putting them at risk of hell, there is no goodness of that relationship. The fact that the people who are doing this may buy each other dinner or be nice to them in other settings is irrelevant. We don't say the mafia does a lot of good when they sponsor, a dinner for poor people in the neighborhood at Christmas. If you're in the business of killing people, get out of that business. We don't bless them and say, well, as long as you do something else nice, we're going to overlook this. So this bishop, realize this is where I say we are in such a difficult situation. I'm a Catholic priest from New York, speaking in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we have a bishop in Berlin who's encouraging people to commit mortal sins and then pretending that a priest can bless this because somehow this relationship is good. Now, the hypocrisy, which is what it is, goes even further. the story says, but at the same time as he permitted priests to confer same-sex blessings, he said he would not perform such ceremonies in person until the Pope had explicitly permitted them to take place. So, this is hypocrisy. It's good for you to do it, it's not good for me. Why? Well, because the Pope hasn't explicitly permitted it. Well, wait, if the Pope hasn't permitted it and that's keeping you from doing it, why are you telling the priest to do it? Now, the Pope did have something explicit about it because in 2021, he approved the publication of a decree from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith which said such blessings are not possible because you cannot bless sin. What happened after the bishop wrote this letter? Nothing. Okay, we're now a couple of weeks since this was published. The Pope has said nothing. This bishop is acting in a rebellious fashion. He's leading people into sin. He's confirming them in an erroneous conscience and in a false notion. You know what a blessing is? A blessing is to invoke God's favor upon something. So we bless material objects, and we bless places, we bless people, and we also bless relationships. So this is, when you have your 25th wedding anniversary, there's a ritual to bless the relationship, The relationship is already in the sacramental marriage, of course, a source of grace, but a blessing is say, God, continue to favor. And then people say, well, God knows what he wants to favor, but guess what? God told us to ask him for his favors. So the idea that you cannot bless something that's leading people to sin, but that's exactly what this bishop is asking us to do. Why is this? What is this all about? Well, it fits into this pattern. The Germans had something called the Synodal Way, which is different than the Synod on Synodality, but they've issued a series of documents proposing all kinds of things, including blessing of same-sex unions, ordination of women, other outrages in the life of the church. What do we have? We have widening chaos and things that are not according to what the church is asking us to do. Now, Pope Francis was asked about things like what I'm doing right now, which is critiquing this process, and he was asked about this on his trip to Portugal. He had World Youth Day in Lisbon. It was a big success. There were 1 million or more people present at the final Mass, and those produce good fruits. But this is what the Pope says. This is a quote, "You have seen that in the United States the situation is not easy. There is a very strong reactionary attitude. It is organized and shapes the way people belong, even emotionally. I would like to remind those people that indietrismo, which is an Italian word meaning backward-lookingness, or backwardness. Backwardness is useless, and we need to understand that there is an appropriate evolution in the understanding of matters of faith and morals, as long as they follow the 3 criteria that Vincent of Lerins already dictated in the 5th century. Doctrine evolves so that it might be consolidated, it might be developed in time, and become mature in age. In other words, doctrine also progresses, expands, and consolidates with time and becomes firmer, but it's always progressing. Change develops from the roots upwards, growing in accord with these criteria." So the Pope is saying that doctrine progresses. Doctrine does not progress. The understanding of the teaching can. But progress doesn't mean negation. Progress means fulfillment. Progress is an acorn becoming an oak tree. It's not an acorn becoming a cherry tree, which is impossible. Now, the Pope said the following. Let's get to specifics. Today it is a sin to possess atomic bombs. The death penalty is a sin. You cannot employ it, but it was not so before. It is not a sin to possess atomic weapons. The Church has never taught that. The immoral use of atomic weapons is a sin. But its appropriate use, which is conceivable in theory, is not a sin. The death penalty has never been called a sin by the Church. In fact, it's taught the exact opposite, that it's a just act for certain crimes. So now the Pope is saying you cannot employ the death penalty, but you could in the past. Well, there's a lot of confusion because Pope Francis changed the catechism on this. penalties. He said the death penalty is no longer admissible. That's a very confusing word. Admissible is a legal term, is evidence admissible in court type of thing. Admissible meaning, can we approve of its use? So the Pope then says, the view of church doctrine as monolithic is erroneous. So monolith is a big stone. You know, big stones don't change. So it's by analogy, you would say, the church doctrine is a big stone, but it can change. This is not how we look at it. It's very regrettable. Now, the Pope said the following: you have been to the United States. He's talking to a Jesuit brother. You've been to the United States and you say you have felt a climate of closure. This climate can be experienced in some situations, and there you can lose the true tradition and turn to ideologies for support. In other words, ideology replaces faith. Membership of a sector of the church replaces membership of the church. So I just bring that up because I think the Pope has misunderstood the nature of the critique that's being given by Cardinal Burke and others to this synodal process. And certainly when you look at, like, the Bishop of Berlin, why is it that he can contradict church teaching and not be corrected? And he claims that this is part of how things are going in the life of the church. What is ideology? Is the Catechism of the Catholic Church ideology? Of course not. So to defend the Catechism is not ideological. The Pope is using that, I think, to discredit in advance people who contradict some of the things that he's saying. But again, you may remember at the first synod on the family, the Pope said, don't be afraid to the synod member. Don't be afraid to say something because you think the Pope won't agree with it. So that's why I and many others say, okay, we'll take you at your word, Holy Father. And not only that, we think it's a duty in faith. We think if you made a mistake in interpretation. Now, is it pleasant to go through all these things? No, it's never pleasant, to do something that might scandalize people. And that's not my intent here. But Cardinal Burke, as others say, this is a revolution in process. And then these topics for discussion are very concerning. I think this has an impact on vocations because young men are saying, where are we going? What are we supposed to do? I'm going to stop right now and just say the answer is to do what you're already doing, to encourage prayer. Say the doctrine of the faith is solid. It doesn't change. The Catechism doesn't have a paragraph which says everything in this book is subject to revision at a future date. It doesn't say that because it's not, and we can't pretend that it is. And if the Pope, wants to promote things like this, the most respectful thing you can do is say, Holy Father, I won't support that for the following reasons, and then cite logic, not emotion, but logic, and say, John Paul II said this, Benedict said that, etc., etc. And thank you for your attention.